Hello, everyone, and welcome to the weekly DeSmogCAST, where we clear the PR pollution that clouds climate science and shed some light on the biggest environmental news stories of the week that you need to know about. I'm your host, Farron Cousin, and joining me this week, we have Carol Linnitt, the Managing Editor and Director of Research for DeSmog Canada, Brendan DeMelle, the Executive Director and Managing Editor of DeSmogBlog.com, and Kyla Mandel, the Deputy Editor of DeSmog UK. Thank you all for joining us this week. Carol, let's jump right into it. This week you've had some big stories coming out of DeSmog Canada. One of the top ones you've had is basically talking about the fact that in Canada, while you do not have the same problems that we have in the United States as far as campaign contributions go, you are still getting massive amounts of influence over public policy from the fossil fuel industry. Go ahead and lay out the story for us.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a report that was just released by a group called SHARE, the Shareholders Association for Research and Education, and they just released a report called Dollars, Democracy, and Disclosure. And what they did was they looked at all of the disclosure laws or lack of disclosure laws in Canada around corporate political spending. So as you mentioned, we have a complete zero rule about corporate contributions to federal elections, but we have a total mishmash of rules when it comes to election spending during provincial elections. We have very limited disclosure rules around lobbying, around corporate spending to influence the content and tenor of public political debates, influence of lobbyists when it comes to regulation. So what this report does is sort of takes an overview look at all the ways that these private interests, these corporations, and they're looking particularly at publicly traded corporations and how they're spending money to influence regulation and policy in Canada. And what they found was that there's no standardized disclosure rules whatsoever. So really what they were trying to do is expose the risk that is held by shareholders. They say these companies, when they are making decisions to influence political debate or regulation or public policy, that does actually have a material risk that is posed to the company. It's the shareholders who shoulder that risk, and oftentimes they don't even know what kind of spending is going on, but at the company level.
So overall, I guess basically the theory is that for every law that's out there, a corporation, particularly the fossil fuel industry, is so good at this, they're going to find a loophole around that law. They may not be able to write a check for $10,000 to a candidate, but they know exactly who to write a check to in order to still get what they want. I mean, is that basically in a nutshell what you're seeing up there?
Yeah, and I mean, just like in the U.S., we see a lot of money being sort of flowing from major oil and gas industry to, say, think tanks or organizations that advocate for a certain, public position on very contentious issues. In Canada, this happens a lot with pipelines or carbon tax or climate policy, those types of things. They did point to another interesting example. This just happened in Canada. TransCanada, the proponent of the Keystone XL pipeline, is also trying to get approval for another massive pipeline to run across Canada. The pipeline's called Energy East. And TransCanada, in an attempt to win favor from the public and small communities along the pipeline route, they hired Edelman, and a sort of notoriously dirty at times public relations firm, to basically manage their ground war. And those documents were the documents that outlined their strategy for winning public support of this pipeline were leaked. And that had huge implications, pretty bad implications for both TransCanada and Edelman. So as they mentioned in the report, there are risks associated, reputational risks at the very least, associated with a company like TransCanada choosing to purchase the influence and the strategies of a company like Edelman. So they ask these basic questions like, should that kind of spending be disclosed to shareholders? And we aren't having that conversation yet in Canada, and they raise a lot of good points. And basically what they're trying to do is start a conversation about what kind of disclosure rules should we have in Canada.
In the United States, the Center for Public Integrity just a couple weeks ago came out with a report that shows that corporations, while they're still spending, hundreds of millions of dollars on lobbying, they're also now starting to pump huge money into massive PR campaigns because they've found out that it's easier to change the mind of the public and get them to support a project than it is to buy off a politician who will approve a project, but then it becomes unpopular with the public. So now corporations, and I'm assuming the same thing will start happening, like you said with Edelman in Canada, is that they're going to work trying to change the public's opinion and making the public be the ones get out there demanding that these projects get finished. And to me, that is almost one of the dirtiest tricks possible. And speaking of the dirty energy industry getting everything they want, Kyla, a couple weeks ago we discussed the fact that there had been a proposed, I assume it was an amendment to a bill, if I remember correctly, that could have the potential to ban fracking in the United Kingdom. But this week, something completely different ended up happening. You reported on it. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, so what happened was previously at the end of January, the government had proposed pretty stringent requirements on fracking, which is slowly getting going in the UK. But a new bill has just become an act now, so it's been passed into law, which has very weak fracking standards. So it was passed through in a very rushed one-hour debate in Parliament with huge support from climate deniers. And basically, this is a big backtrack by government on agreements previously made in January, which would have had strict standards on fracking. So what's happened now, instead, in relation to national parks and groundwater, is that these standards are very weak. So, for example, with national parks, while previously these were basically a no-go zone for fracking, now you might not be allowed fracking in a national park, you're allowed fracking under a national park. So the company could set up the well just outside on the boundaries of the park, but then they could drill horizontally underneath the park. And this also applies to areas of outstanding natural beauty, for example. But then the second problem is that these protected areas, so whether it's a national park or an area of great beauty or groundwater zones, these definitions haven't been included in the Act. So it's very flexible. It's going to be chosen at a later date by the Secretary of State. They'll be the ones who define what these areas are. This is despite previous drafts of the bill having definitions in them, as well as the government's Environment Agency also has definitions, for example, for what constitutes a groundwater safety zone. So these aren't in the bill, or sorry, the Act now. And this was one point that climate deniers were very, supportive of. They said that claims that groundwater wouldn't be contaminated by fracking, that this had no merit, and they said that by leaving out definitions, it would have greater flexibility for industry. So essentially what you have now is an act in law with very weak fracking standards, which has been pushed through Parliament pretty rapidly with the support of climate deniers.
What has been the influence of the industry in order to get this act passed?
Well, in the past month or so, there's been growing opposition to fracking, so there's been tons of protests, especially as this bill's been debated. So what we've seen actually is quite a bit of opposition to fracking, and so then obviously there's been a very big pushback because the standards agreed previously in the earlier draft, that was an improvement, and people were looking forward to stricter standards, but then obviously there was the big push to make them weaker, and then that was successful.
So, Brendan, bringing it back to the United States here, we just talked about the influence that the industry has in Canada, the influence that they're having in the UK, but here in the United States, they don't need to have influence because government and industry at this point, they've really become one and the same. And I think a fantastic example is Rick Perry from the oil-rich state of Texas. He's basically dropped all pretenses, even though he's facing felony investigations, he is a dirty energy guy now, isn't he? I mean, he's in the industry.
That's right. I mean, he's just announced that he's joined the board of a Fortune 500 oil company run by a Texas billionaire who was a big contributor to his 2012 campaign in Texas for governor. So he now facing, as you said, felony charges for abuse of power in Texas, has joined this company to help push through a very controversial oil pipeline that would shuttle back in crude oil, that really explosive stuff from North Dakota, over to Illinois and then ultimately down to the Gulf Coast, where, who knows where it'll go. It's certainly not to the benefit of Iowans. So there's a lot of amazing pieces to this. Number one, you've got Rick Perry, who's announced his intention to seek the Republican nomination. Whether or not he does is kind of up in the air, but here he is. When most candidates typically shed board positions, Perry has hopped on to this board of directors of Energy Transfer Partners, is the name of the company run by the Texas oil billionaire. So backwards move. And so this pipeline, which would run through Iowa, not to the benefit of Iowans, and involve a lot of government, taking of private property and farmlands in Iowa's agricultural, amazingly strong soils, amazing lands. It's kind of dumbfounding, because what Perry's doing is essentially tanking any grassroots support that he would have from that base of private property rights advocates, from libertarians concerned about government overreach and eminent domain, and from the conservative Republicans who aren't the corporatist wing of the party. So it doesn't quite make any sense. And as I said, this oil pipeline is highly controversial. It's going to be a hot potato in the run-up to the 2016 Iowa caucus. And here's Rick Perry essentially declaring himself an oil lobbyist.
Well, you really hit it on the head right there with the fact that obviously Rick Perry has been a Republican governor of Texas, served 3 terms, I believe. Now he wants to be the Republican nominee for president. And within the Republican Party in the United States, we've seen such a huge growth in the libertarian wing of the party, I guess you'd call it. And their big thing is private property. I don't know if you've seen Iron Man 2. That is a libertarian's dream, about the government trying to take his property. But eminent domain is a big deal with pipelines. That's one of the biggest issues they're having with Keystone XL right now. I know there's several lawsuits trying to say that the government or this private company cannot come in and take our property to run their pipeline because it's not in the public good. And so Perry has found himself on the wrong side of a huge portion of his party in a state that is crucial to the future of the Republican nominee. So I don't see at this point how Perry goes any further with his campaign, especially, you can't be a member of the industry. I don't care who you are, which party you're with, and expect to win in America today, because we do have a very anti-corporate mood happening right now. And Perry, I believe, has found himself on the wrong side of that. Brendan, real quick, we've only got a minute or two here. Today, as of the filming of this, the House of Representatives has sent President Obama a bill approving Keystone XL pipeline. Obama had promised a veto. If he does follow through with that veto, do the Republicans give up, or do they continue pushing?
I don't think there's any chance that they'll give up, just because they are so beholden to the oil industry and really have shown their true colors, having announced that as their highest priority for this Congress, starting out with the Keystone XL bill, which, surely President Obama is now, getting his pen ready to veto. The Republicans aren't going to stop. They haven't stopped in any of their other shenanigans, so I can't imagine that they're going to stop being the oil lobbyists that they've proven to be lately. So the American people have seen this, and I suspect that it's going to have consequences, in future elections. But for now, what we see is a return to the process. I imagine, with this veto, the president will continue the process that has been underway the whole time to review this on the grounds of national interest and its climate impacts. And ultimately, everyone hopes that he says no, who's concerned about the future of this country. So,
right. It's disappointing that the Keystone XL pipeline is a partisan issue. There's nothing inherently political about the pipeline. There shouldn't be. We've seen the assessments. We know what could happen. We know that there's really no oversight or any kind of protective measures in place. Bad idea from start to finish. But that is all of the time that we have for this week. All these stories that we've talked about and more you can find on DeSmogBlog.com, DeSmog.ca, and DeSmog.uk, and we will see you on next week's DeSmogCast. Thank you for watching.